Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist. Join me as I seek out the small incremental changes being applied in other industries that we can learn from and that can be applied in healthcare. Can these changes bring immediate value but also add up to the big improvements and the revolution we need in healthcare? Come along with me to explore the possibilities. My innovative guests from around the globe have used small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot. And today, I'm talking to Ari Lightman. He's the professor of digital media and marketing at the Heinz College in Carnegie Mellon University. I'm delighted to have him with me. Hi, Ari. How are you today?
Good, Nick. How you doing?
So thanks for joining me. I know you've got so many things going on in your center. You've got a lot of activity around the culture and in particular the digital media and the way that we interact with that. I wanted to kick off by asking you about some of the potential changes that you see in the way that we interact with information in the healthcare space and some of the ways that we as patients and also as clinicians can start to use the digital tools that we have at our disposal, but use them effectively versus this sort of moonshot approach that so many people have in their minds.
So let me use a allegory from other industries in that we're creating a tremendous amount of complex information, and we see it across multiple different industries, whether it's financial services or screen-based media, news, what have you, manufacturing. All this complex information, we're understanding how to visualize it better. So the idea of just creating massive levels of dashboards that people have to interact with is, I think, confusing the matter more. And people have to understand, going back to sort of the notion of how to tell a digital story. So the storyline, the thought process around it, and really sort of communicating complex information to multiple different audiences, but also understanding how they cognitively process information and what they do with it. So I think the same thing can be applied into the digital health space and medicine, is where patients, because of the digitization of multiple different types of procedures, multiple different types of condition sets, multiple different types of information that's available, pretty soon we're going to overwhelm the patient in terms of how to assess and organize this information. We could just go back to looking at things like, how do you understand between two different insurance plans online? And we had to create applications to sort of be able to quickly assess them and present them to somebody so they could normalize the data between 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 plans. We need to think of the same things within healthcare. How are we going to communicate a story that can be processed intuitively by multiple different types of audiences? Some might be digital savvy, some might not be digitally savvy at all. So we have to think a little bit about, what does that user interaction look like? How are people going to ingest the data and act upon it? And that's when we need different skill sets, Nick. I think we need to bring people in who are ethnographic specialists. We need people in who understand sort of cognitive psychology and processing of information, because the last thing we want to happen, especially in the healthcare space, is for people to use that information in an inappropriate manner, or in a manner that doesn't fit the constraints of that particular situation, right? We don't want to see higher levels of readmission rates because people use the information improperly. We don't want to see sort of panic ensue because people are responding to information in a way that we hope they wouldn't, but with all these digital means of sharing information, we'll see things that are just erroneous, like, sort of information about about infactual information around vaccination, right? Those sorts of things. And you could see sort of information dissemination online. There's got to be a means and a mechanism for healthcare practitioners to understand why it's occurring, and not how to combat it, but how to sort of make sure that greater levels of factuality gets put into health information that gets shared online.
So you bring up a number of really interesting points, and particularly the overwhelming nature of that data for both patients, their carers, and indeed clinicians. I mean, when I went to medical school, we were sort of processing probably too much information at that time, but because it was not in digital form, it didn't sort of arrive quite as quickly as it does now. Have you seen any sort of innovations or concepts that can help us allow people to comprehend and understand what it is that they're dealing with to make better decisions out of all of that?
Yeah, I mean, once again, I'll use another industry, Nick, to sort of provide example. If you look at what the New York Times is doing, it's pretty fascinating. So they're creating 360-degree stories. They're investing heavily into augmented reality and virtual reality. And I understand that these concepts are far off in specific use cases, but I think the idea here is if you allow people a means to interact with data elements, they cognitively process it better. So when I mentioned before dashboards after dashboards is just a plethora, tsunami of data that you have to process yourself. But if you're interacting with the data elements and moving them around to see what happens, now you're processing it at a different level, and you're understanding sort of tangential relationships, not really causality, but looking at sort of correlative factors that if I take off, if I reduce my cholesterol by this amount, how will I compare to my population group associated with how often people exercise, how often in terms of the nutrition, they're eating properly. So now I'm looking at things in terms of a relationship, not just me and an abstract number, but me in relationship to a population segment.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I recently saw something that talked about this, where instead of just giving people a target for an obesity, reduction in weight, for instance, and a reduction in BMI, tying that value for that individual down to, if you do this, here are the personal consequences, as best as we can tell based on the statistical analysis, the probability that it will impact you, it will improve your cardiovascular health, it will improve your life expectancy, quality of life. I think, great concepts and small changes, really. It's reuse of the same information, just presenting it in a slightly different fashion, which I think is very much part of, the concepts that you describe in your digital media and marketing, where you're taking the same data but presenting it in different ways.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what, especially within some of the healthcare providers and payers that we've spoken to, they jumped on sort of this wagon of trying to create gamification concepts, which I love because, building a game is really hard. And I understand the rationale why you want better levels of engagement. So if you gamify a mechanism around, let's say, preventative maintenance, you'll see more people come in. But you really have to understand sort of the incentives and the motivation patterns around why you would gamify any type of process. But where I'm coming from is looking at sort of, as you mentioned, a target goal and looking at it in relation to something you can associate with is an incremental change. As opposed to saying your BMI needs to be X based on a variety of different characteristics and condition sets. Now you're saying, okay, here's your BMI as a target population, and here's the sort of the associated benefits that will ensue, but allowing the user to interact with that so they really understand the causes, the outputs, and potentially even developing their own sort of plan of action.
So you talked a little bit in the past about the security of that information, and contextually at the moment there's a lot of discussion about all of this data that's being shared. People are accessing it. I know you talk about this sort of transformation and how we provide this framework to individuals. How do you see that sort of evolving, particularly in the context of what's going on today? Where do you see us going?
So I think there's a multi-pronged approach here. There's individuals, there's organizations, there's government authorities, but I think we need a greater levels of awareness of how data gets transferred from one entity to another. And I think if we bring in folks who are ethicists to really understand third-party data aggregators, second-party sort of data collectors, those sorts of things. But we have to understand where data sits. So where's the data bank, right? So, in my case, I'm in Pittsburgh. UPMC is my healthcare provider. They have a collection of my data, right? I can authorize UPMC to share data with other data providers, right? And much like I do Facebook, right? I say I want to log into this application. I don't want to bother putting in all the information. I just want Facebook to send them information. But deep down, buried within that privacy statement, is all the information that the partner application is asking Facebook to share with them. That's known to me. Nobody really even looks at that. But it's a mind-boggling array of information asked in terms of behavior patterns, in terms of demographics, in terms of your friend profile, in terms of what app you use prior to coming to the app. So there's data that the app needs, there's data that the app wants from Facebook, which is sort of the data sink, if you will. But then there might be other parties that share data with Uber as well. So now you're disaggregated, if you will, from the data sink, but there's still people that are, and companies and applications that are using part of the data with my consent, but I'm not really quite sure how it can be used in aggregate. So here's where we have interesting privacy issues that come into play. And we were just talking about what's happening right now with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. But these issues are multifaceted. They're difficult to understand. And you might have made your peace with how Facebook utilizes your data, but maybe not really quite aware of how a data partner, an application, might utilize the data that they collect from Facebook as well as the data that they collect associated with your utilization. So we're going to see this a lot more when we start getting into greater levels of health applications, right? And Apple just released 11.3, which has now, if your healthcare provider is so inclined and has the API associated with it, now you could share information right to your Apple device that could go into Apple Health. So now you can start tracking and monitoring that information in a user interface that is you're more accustomed to, if you will, and you could share that with health data that you've collected just in terms of your day in and day out activities. So seeing this blend of different types of applications, health monitors, health applications, now electronic medical records, and how they're being provided to large companies, potentially Google, right now it's Apple, those sorts of things, and then the integration of a variety of different type of health and wellness applications is going to be very daunting. We have to abstract all the privacy policies. We have to understand what these folks are doing with your medical data, as well as your health data and your personal data. And we have to understand sort of the flow of information across the open web. These digital breadcrumbs that you leave in multiple different digital repositories, we've shown time and time again, can be abstracted and utilized in malicious ways to recreate your identity. So I think the user has to be more keen, more aware. I can't comment right now whether we're going to see greater levels of regulation, whether HHS, HIPAA is going to have a say associated with digital health and the ability of some of these third-party data repositories to be audited and to be in compliance with specific sort of strict guidelines or regulations. What I hope does not happen is that it doesn't stifle innovation in space. And
yeah,
we've seen that happen before.
Couldn't agree more. The balance between stifling innovation, I think, is a key asset here. So for those of you just joining, thanks for tuning in today. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Ari Lightman, the Professor of Digital Medicine and Marketing at the Heinz College of Carnegie Mellon University. Ari, you were talking about this issue of privacy and the complexity of all of that. And one of the things that I'm challenged with, I'm sure most people listening are, is these approvals that we sign off on whenever we access something. So be it Apple, Facebook, you name it, they all have them. I don't think I've read a single one of them, and even if I did, I'm not sure that I would understand it. One of the things that I've seen that I thought was really interesting that sort of blends technology in this was providing an artificial intelligence. So it was a machine learning that you could send them the EULA or in fact a link to it, and they would give you the highlights of the relevant context of what was in that and what you were essentially signing. Any thoughts around that and how users can try and manage and understand what it is that they're giving up when they sign up for these services?
Absolutely, Nick. So we're actually doing a lot of research on creating machine learning layers associated with privacy statements, but also looking at sort of complex simulations associated with what is a black swan event associated with your all of your identity that you shared with maybe 2 or 3 dozen apps online. All right. One of the things that a lot of security researchers take a look at, which is fascinating new area of exploration, is this whole idea of social engineering. So I'm sure I could go online. You're a pretty social guy. You have lots of information online. I could get a variety of different types of information on you, on me, those sorts of things. And if I wanted to create a very sophisticated phish attempt, I could do that, right? So we're seeing this more and more being thrown into hospital systems. And I think I read one study where greater than 50% of hospital systems have been subject to phishing attacks, and some other larger percentage have been susceptible to them. So you have a variety of different types of inside actors. You might have nurse, you might have allied health professionals, you might have dietitians, you might have a whole bunch of operational folks and IT folks, you might have physicians. Each of them can be subject to a phish attempt, and a very sophisticated phish attempt. And we've done this over and over again. We did a study where we actually did some social phishing into a national lab. We got information on all the various different scientists. We knew who they were, where they lived, who their friends were, those sorts of things in some cases, even sent out links to be connected to them, if you will. And then sort of as a test, sort of as a simulated exercise, we called in, trying to spoof that we were the information technology department, the IT department. In most of the cases, everybody said the right thing, right? Said, no, forget it. I can't give you out any sort of information. One gentleman who basically was late, and his daughter was probably up all night, sick, and he was all haggard, and he said, fine, here you go. So in those kind of cases, it looks very credible. It looks very real because this information is available and you could utilize it, and then you could use it for an exploitation, unfortunately. And it's not that somebody's being malicious. It's not like sort of an insider malicious threat. It's somebody who's just, trying to do their day in and day out job and just inadvertently clicks a message. Sometimes you have multiple different windows open at the same time. You inadvertently click that link, and that's it. You've been phished, you've been hacked. So we have to understand that as all of this information gets shared and more information gets thrown out there in the sake of social good and social utility, that could be used as an exploit against you at some point in time in the future.
Completely in alignment with that. I think the ease with which that's achieved, and I talked about this relatively recently in a blog post that talked about, the issue of human beings. We want to help others, and the ease with which you can play upon that, and the manipulation of sort of social context that allows for that. I'm curious to know how you see the ways in which we can help, particularly in healthcare, that has this huge target on its back for all the data. It's such a rich data set that it's so valuable to the community that's hacking that. How can we help individuals, and indeed, that research that you did, what was the ultimate guidance? Did you provide them with feedback that said, hey, you did a good job here, but here are some of the things that you can do that continue to sort of help? I mean, my feeling around that is this ongoing process of exposing the ease with which we can dig into inappropriate pieces of information and helping people understand the impact of that so that they're aware of it. Awareness seems to be the sort of incremental improvement that we can bring to help combat this.
So I think you're absolutely right, Nick. I think there's a couple of different incremental improvements. One is definitely creating campaigns around awareness. The more that people engage in a learning-based environment in terms of what constitutes a fish-level attack so they could avoid that in the future, understand how these unique cases sort of come up, what it means, but also organizations need to be much better in terms of setting up their information flows and their network infrastructure, right? So you could actually segment from a physical infrastructure a network. You could segment from a service architecture a network, those sorts of things. That needs to be thought of, once you're sort of designing this out. And the simulation exercise is what happens if we have a WannaCry attack and we have to take down a certain part of our network. So there's, we talk about this in my CISO executive education program, which we have in conjunction with the Software Engineering Institute, and a lot of healthcare professionals come through, and they share a lot of stories. They, sometimes lament about what's happened, how their organization has dealt with it, and what they want to do in the future. But this idea of information sharing is an incremental improvement. And there was a healthcare security study, and I'm drawing a blank on the name. It was sponsored by HHS and a number of other organizations, but basically came up with this overarching notion that security is overwhelmingly underfunded and underutilized in the healthcare space. And they need to get, it was a sort of a battle cry that they need to get better at it considerably. I mean, if you look at the Hollywood Presbyterian and sort of the ransomware, they sort of exploited a server that wasn't patched properly, right? They knew about it before any of the healthcare IT administrators knew about it, and they sort of held the organization hostage for a period of time. These are going to happen over and over again because of the vulnerability of healthcare institutions, because of the lack of sort of healthcare infrastructure that's available, that's out there. But we also need to be very reactive. And as you know, I teach classes on data analytics, and understanding sort of normal ebb and flow associated with data, how it sort of gets disseminated across a network is really important, because if anomalies occur, does it signify that there's an issue happening around an exfiltration, right? So we got to get smarter associated with understanding how information flows, who has access, who has permissions, how to segment the network, and look at for various different anomalous signal detection, I think.
So I think great sort of concepts, and those small improvements that we can apply that we're constantly seeking as part of this sort of continued innovation. I think we're all trying to march in the same direction, but we're overwhelmed, and helping folks pass through that is obviously something that you're very focused on. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I just leaves me an opportunity to say thank you for joining me. It's just been absolutely fascinating. I wish so much that I lived in Pittsburgh, and I'm envious of the folks that do, because the opportunity to attend some of those sessions and hear some of those insights would be fantastic. Ari, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Nick, and it's a great program.
So thanks for joining me today. Do you have any better ideas, or have you found a small incremental change that has brought about a big improvement in your world? Let's continue the conversation on our hashtag, the Incrementalist, or share it with me at Dr. Nick1 on Twitter. You can find out more information about the show on our program page at healthcarenowradio.com.